All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for another day. Thank you for helping us to get through this week of extremely hot weather. And we do thank you for the sun that we need to help things to grow. And we just thank you for all the things you provide for us. Pray that you would teach us, help us to understand these things that are kind of difficult to understand, but to be like the Bereans who search the Scriptures to find out if the things that are being said are according to your word or not. Guide us and lead us according to your truth. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, welcome to the Friedensburg Biblical Institute. This is class number 5, the last class on Protestant resistance theology. And we are concluding, as I said, we're concluding our discussion on Protestant resistance theology today. I am glad that there are people here that are not only interested in church history, but also in political theory from a biblical worldview, because that is a part of church history. In my opinion, this class would be probably an anomaly or even an absurdity on the Lord's Day in some churches across the land. The well-known phrase, keep religion and politics separate, has taken deep root in the thinking of many Westerners. Unfortunately, in an attempt to fence off bad thinking about government, people have grown ignorant about the matter and are at the point where they know almost nothing anymore that is truly important that's related to it. COVID proved this point with alarming statistics. So far from churches proving that they believed in a separation between religion and politics. In fact, they actually prove that they do unwittingly hold a view of government, and it's not good. I remember dozens of times when I personally heard Christians say that we ought to obey the government. Why? Because Romans 13. In other words, the voice of the state is the voice of God. Obey the state, right or wrong. But is the state the voice of God? Does Romans 13 teach that the government is allowed to make up its own job description? Or does Romans 13 teach that the government has a limited role with limited responsibilities and specific functions? I will answer these questions later. I would like to point out, though, that ignoring a biblical understanding of government inadvertently leads you to accept an unbiblical one. Pastors who unwittingly or ignorantly refuse to teach their members what the Bible has to say about government end up politicizing them. Well, I would certainly agree that the state should not interfere with the church, and even more that it has no authority over the church. I don't believe that the Scriptures teach us to be ignorant about government. In fact, believers are commanded to have a biblical view of government because the Bible speaks directly about it. And since the Bible speaks about this matter, we must pay attention to it, not ignore it. Today we are going to look at a man who decided not to ignore the government's encroachment upon his church. We will look partly at his life, and then we will examine his key work or writing in which he addresses an abusive form of government. That man is Samuel Rutherford. His key work on the subject of resistance theology, in fact, the most comprehensive work on the subject that came out of the Reformation, was Lex Rex. I have a copy of it up here, if I can impress. Lex Rex means the law and the king, or the law and the prince. Before we get into Rutherford's writing, though, let's look at his life and the events that led up to him producing this magnificent book. It's kind of hot in here, so I'm glad I got water. Samuel Rutherford was born in 1600 in Nisbet, Scotland. His father was a farmer of some considerable wealth. His childhood home was nominally Christian, yet his parents took notice of his giftedness, especially his intellectual abilities. By the time Rutherford was 20 years old, he had obtained a Master of Arts degree, from which he became skilled in Latin and Greek. 5 years later, he begins studying theology, again at the University of Edinburgh. Nothing is certain to know about the exact date of Rutherford's conversion. The best that historians are able to ascertain is that it happened sometime in his early 20s. At the age of 26, he is called to pastor at a church in Anwath in Scotland. Interestingly, this was the same church that 2.5 decades earlier was pastored by one of John Knox's son-in-laws. Also, the church that Rutherford was called to was in a rural setting in a farming community, which wasn't a bad fit for Rutherford, being a farm boy himself. Rutherford was deeply committed to his pastoral ministry in Anwath. And I think it was he was roughly 26 years of age when he was called to the ministry in Anwath. Some compared his labors in Anwath to the type of pastoral ministry set forth in Richard Baxter's book, The Reformed Pastor. On a personal level, Rutherford spent hours each morning preparing himself for ministry. I think he woke up at 3 a.m. But, when you read that he woke up at 3 a.m., I ask, well, I wonder what time he went to bed at, though, because they also didn't have electricity back then. If you go to bed at 8 o'clock, waking up at 3 isn't that hard. But at any rate, part of his preparation included meditating outside amidst the beautiful countryside. And I have a quote here from Joel Beeke's book, which I also have up here, Meet the Puritans, an excellent book about all the Puritans in England, English and Scottish. This is a quote from Beeke. One aged contemporary pastor wrote, "I have known many great and good ministers in this church, but for such a piece of clay as Mr. Rutherford was, I never knew one in Scotland like him, to whom so many great gifts were given. For he seemed to be altogether taken up with everything good and excellent and useful. He seemed to be always praying, always preaching, always visiting the sick, always catechizing, always writing and studying. Many times I thought he would have flown out of the pulpit when he came to speak of Jesus Christ. He was never in his right element, but when he was commending him. He would have fallen asleep in bed, speaking of Christ." End quote. That's a pretty commendable summary of the ministerial labors of Rutherford. 3 years into Rutherford's pastoral labors, he began to face some serious trials. There was two particular that stood out. The first one was his dear wife, and I'm going to probably butcher her name, Euphramie. I don't know. It looks like Euphrates, but she dies after months and months of suffering from some sort of ailment. He also suffered the loss of all of his children except for one. The second trial was, and I quote from Beeke, to appear before the Court of High Commission in Edinburgh for nonconformity to the Perth Articles, end quote. What were the Perth Articles? The Perth Articles were related to the ordering of worship in the Church of Scotland, which would have been authorized by the king. This was an imposition by the king upon the Church of Scotland. So the 5 articles were kneeling during communion, private baptism, confirmation by bishops, and the observance of holy days. The problem that Rutherford had with the Articles of Perth was not so much what was in the articles as it was that the king was trying to dictate the order of worship in the church. Rutherford not only had the skill but also the courage to defend his church and the Church of Scotland by extension from this unlawful encroachment by the monarch. Like John Knox, Rutherford began speaking out against and resisting the corruption in the church. But this soon led to confronting corruption in the civil government. Because in many cases, as we've learned from previous lessons, they were conjoined, like Siamese twins. Rutherford would minister for 7 more years in Anwath until, because he would not submit to English bishops, his ministerial office was taken away. This was a painful experience for Rutherford to go through. But it was also during this time that Rutherford wrote his famous letters, which are still in print. Shortly after Rutherford's pastoral office was taken away, the Church of Scotland signed the National Covenant, which reinstated total autonomy to the Church of Scotland. Protestantism was gaining the upper hand in Scotland again. I think the date for the National Covenant was like 1638 or 1640. Protestantism was gaining the upper hand in Scotland. And the Church of Scotland then asks Rutherford, who's free now, he's a free agent, to teach at St. Mary's College in St. Andrews, which he accepted. I quote Beeke again. Quote, less than 2 years after he returned to St. Andrews in the fall of 1647, Rutherford was appointed principal of St. Mary's College and in 1651, rector of the university. He spent the last 14 years of his life teaching and preaching at St. Andrews. Some of Rutherford's greatest writings came out of this period. He participated in the Westminster Standards, especially contributing to greatly to the Shorter Catechism. But our particular interest will be in his book, which came out of this period, which is Lex Rex, which was published in 1644. So the Westminster Standards would have been from 1643 to, I think, 1647. So like right in the middle of that whole formulation, that whole Reformation in theology and in doctrine, Rutherford writes this book. What led Rutherford to write Lex Rex? He writes it as a response to a treatise that was published by a guy named John Maxwell. John Maxwell published a treatise called Sacro Sancta Regnum Majestas, which means the sacred and royal prerogative of Christian kings. This is also known, you would be familiar with it as the divine right of kings. Maxwell's book uses biblical arguments and historical precedent to support the idea of the divine right of kings. Maxwell is specifically going after the Reformed view of civil government. Listen to the full title page of the original edition of Maxwell's book. So, Maxwell, I believe he was a bishop in the Church of England, but the title pages it seemed like for the Puritans, they all like, it wasn't just a title, it was like a paragraph. So here it is. Sacral Sancta Regnum Majestas, or the sacred prerogative of Christian kings, wherein sovereignty is by holy scriptures, reverend antiquity, and sound reason, affected by discussing of 5 questions, and the puritanical, Jesuitical, and anti-monarchical grounds or disproved, and the untruth and weakness of their new devised state principles are discovered. That was the title of Maxwell's book. Rutherford's going to go after it. One other thing about Maxwell. Can anyone guess what verse John Maxwell chose to put at the bottom of the title page? Let's hear it. What verse? There we go, Romans 13. He has chapter and verse. He has the whole thing printed out, Romans 13, 1 and 2. So this has been going on for quite a long time. That is misinterpreting and misapplying Romans 13 to justify an unbiblical obedience to authorities. Rutherford's response is no, the king is not above the law is above the king. That's what Lex Rex means. It means the law is above the king, or above the prince. Before we get into Rutherford's work, though, I want to stop and fill you in on a little bit of Scottish history. I think it's going to be helpful. Because of the work of John Knox in Scotland, the country adopted Protestantism as the official religion in 1560. So I think, I'm trying to remember when Knox died. I think it was like right around that time. I think he died, well, actually I can't remember. But at any rate, they had the Scots Confession of Faith. The Church of Scotland was Calvinistic. And of course, their government was Presbyterian. The Church of Scotland had rejected the Catholic Church both in her teachings and practices, but another form of Catholicism existed. The Church of England still exists. So the Church of England exists because, so it's basically, some people say it's the Catholic Church without the Pope. Well, let me follow my notes here. Because of Henry VIII, the British Isles were no longer under the authority of the Pope. Yet they still practiced the Catholic faith. Although Scotland had become reformed in the church, because the British monarchs sometimes shared rule over the territory of England and Scotland, there was contest over who was in charge of the church. Because in the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, there wasn't a pope, but there was bishops, and the bishops swore allegiance to the monarch. So basically, the king was the head of the church. And that's essentially, if I understand it correctly, the same structure that still exists in England today. The queen and now the king is the monarch, is the head of the church. So bishops are a threat to the Presbyterian system and all the Presbyterian churches in Scotland, and there was lots. This was no small problem for the Church of Scotland because they believed they were allowed to select the leaders for their own churches amongst themselves without the king's permission. Scotland still had work to do to establish itself as autonomous from the monarchy. It would take another 78 years, from 1560 until 1638, until Scotland would be so thoroughly reformed in her church. Pause here. By 1638, 90 to 95% of the people in Scotland belonged to the Church of Scotland. So this was a significant reformation that had spread all throughout Scotland. So the church in Scotland was able to create a constitution called the National Covenant, which established Scotland as autonomous from the monarchy. The Church of Scotland was reformed. It could be characterized by two words: Calvinistic and Presbyterian. Their doctrine was reformed, and so was their ecclesiology. But Scotland was divided between the Church of Scotland, which was Presbyterian, and the Church of England, which was ruled by bishops. One simple way to understand I already told you, one simple way to understand the Church of England is it's the Catholic Church without the Pope. And you know the story of Henry VIII, how he couldn't have a child with, was it Catherine? I can't remember. Well, with his wife. And so he wants to get divorced so he can marry another woman and have a son. And the Pope says no. And he says, fine, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. We're not under your authority. So now I don't know if, I'm assuming that that England was under mass interdict from the Pope, that they would have been just completely excommunicated. I'm assuming that happened, but I don't know that history. At any rate, England still holds on to the beliefs and practices just without the authority of the Pope. So the Church of England is more or less and has an hierarchical structure in their government, whereas the Church of Scotland believed that the Presbyterian model with elders ruling was the biblical model. Okay, so that's a little bit of history for you. Let's get into Lex Rex. Rutherford begins the book by going on an offensive against Maxwell. Now he's a Scot, and he's a feisty. If I was to describe Rutherford from what I've been reading, he's like a mixture between Calvin and Luther. He's very scholarly. He knows his Greek and Latin, And, I can't even read parts of this book because it's in Latin. But then he'll take jabs. He'll take jabs at rulers. He'll take jabs at Maxwell. He calls Maxwell the popish prelate, or prelate, however you pronounce that word. So he's not afraid to speak he really does name calling. Listen to this. This is from Lex Rex, from the preface. This is Rutherford. He's talking about Maxwell. Quote, "This cursed prelate or bishop has written of late a treatise against the Presbyterian government of Scotland, in which there is a bundle of lies, hellish calumnies, which calumnies are defamatory statements, and gross errors," end quote. Rutherford then goes on to list 50 reasons in the preface which expose the lies and errors of his opponent before he even gets into the meat of the book. His book consists of 44 questions. I'm just going to call them chapters, okay? 44 questions. There's no way we have time to look at all 44, so I'm just going to pick 4 key chapters, which I think will be helpful to you as a sampling, preferably about things that we haven't necessarily talked about. All right, we're going to begin with chapter 4. Chapter 4, the title is Whether the King is only and immediately from God and not from the people. Whether the king is only and immediately from God and not from the people. In other words, Rutherford is asking the question, do the people play any part in choosing a king? Or does it just all come from God? So I quote from Rutherford, "The question is whether the kingly office itself is from God. I conceive it is. It flows from the people. The question is concerning the designation of the person. From where is it that this man rather than that man is crowned king? And from where is it? From God immediately and only, that this man rather than that man in this race and family rather than that race and family is chosen for the crown? Or is it from the people also and their free choice? For the pastor's and the doctor's office is from Christ only, but that John rather than Thomas is the doctor or the pastor is from the will and choice of men." So Rutherford is saying, yes, God ordained the office of king, but God does not directly appoint the king, the people do. God does this work, but then he says at the end, but God works through the people too. So they're both true is essentially what he's saying. Just as common people will choose one man and not another to be their pastor, so it is with kings. To say that kings are ordained of God and that God directly appoints them and not the people is both historically as well as biblically inaccurate. Rutherford humorously says that kings are not born with a crown on their head. They are made kings. And some princes do not end up becoming kings because they are not fit for office. But the point is, one person is chosen and another is not. Therefore, the people have a role to play in choosing the king. And Rutherford cites 1 Kings 16. Is it 1 Kings 1:6 or 1 Kings 16? I misprinted something here. But it's in 1 Kings, and I quote him, "The people made Omri king and not Zimri, and his son Ahab rather than Tibni, the son of Sinath. The people made Solomon king and not Adonijah, though Adonijah was the elder brother," end quote. So he concludes the chapter by saying that the way that kings are chosen is by the people, and also that they come from God, the office is appointed, but that the hand of God is with the people in the choosing of the king also. Next, we go to chapter 22. The title for chapter 22 is Whether the Power of the King as King is Absolute or Dependent and Limited by God's First Mold and Pattern of a King. He lists a number of arguments, and I will just name a few of them. First, Rutherford goes to Deuteronomy 17, 18 to 19. He points out that the king is required to not only read the law of God, but make a copy of it for himself. I quote Rutherford, quote, "He who in his first institution is appointed of God by office, even when he sits on the throne, to take heed to read on a written copy of God's law, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and keep all the words of this law. He is not of absolute power above the law, but the king as king, while he sits on the throne, is to do this. This is the law of the king as king," end quote. The book of Deuteronomy makes clear that the king, so far from making laws himself, is to take the already revealed law of God, read it, copy it, and live by it. The king is under the law of God. Next, he argues in chapter 22 that because some kings do not rule according to God's law, but tyrannize their subjects, this proves that they do not have absolute power. Royal power is from God, he says, but power to terrorize people is not from God. For Rutherford, he says that's satanic. For Rutherford, this proves that the power of kings is not absolute. I quote Rutherford here, quote, "God who makes kings and disposes of crowns must also create and give that royal and official power by which a king is king. If this moral power to sin be from God, it being formerly wickedness, then God must be the author of sin." End quote. Rutherford simply saying that we know that God gives men power to become kings, but when the power is abused, when it is used to tyrannize people, it proves that kings do not have absolute power. God does not ordain kings to rule however they wish. They are to rule according to his word. So their power is limited. It's not absolute. Why else would God remove kings from their positions of power if, as some were arguing in Rutherford's day, their power was absolute, to rule however they wished, whether good or evil? Lastly, in chapter 22, Rutherford argues positively about the purpose of the king, namely, that it's for the good of the people. Quote, "To have a king is the blessing of God, because to have no king is a judgment. If the king be a thing good in itself, then he cannot be a curse and a judgment, and essentially a bondage and slavery to the people. Also, the genuine and intrinsic end of a king is the good, and the good of a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness and dignity, whose genuine end is to preserve the law from violence and to defend the subject," end quote. So the power that God gives to kings is to be limited in scope, so that they may be a beneficial ruler towards their subjects. Anything other than this is outside the scope of the power that God has ordained for kings. The next chapter that we will examine is chapter 21. The title is, "What Power the People in States of Parliament Has Over the King and in the State." Rutherford begins with a natural argument here, that in every society you can find what he calls states or estates. By states, he means the lesser magistrates and basically like all the lesser rulers in society, including judges and chiefs, depending on what society you're in. It's not just in Christian societies that we find different levels of government with lesser magistrates and higher magistrates. And I think this goes to prove Romans 13, actually, which says that whatever authority exists has been ordained of God. So God does not just ordain governments for his chosen people, but for all men. Biblically speaking, there is a great deal of support for this idea, and I quote Rutherford again. Quote, "Abner communed with the elders of Israel to bring the king home in 2 Samuel 3:17. And there were elders in Israel, both in the time of the judges and the time of the kings, who did not only give advice and counsel to the judges and kings, which I shall make good by these places. Okay, so he's going to list a number of verses now and quote examples of this. Deuteronomy 21:19. The rebellious son is brought to the elders of the city who had power of life and death and were caused to stone him. Deuteronomy 22:18. The elders of the city shall take that man and chastise him. Joshua 20 verse 4. But besides the elders of every city, there were the elders of Israel and the princes who also had judicial power of life and death as the judges and kings had. Joshua 22:30. Even when Joshua was judge in Israel, the princes of the congregation and heads of the thousands of Israel did judicially consider whether the children of Reuben, of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh were apostates from God and the religion of Israel. So he's listing all these examples in the Old Testament of how lesser magistrates have judicial power over life and death. This is not an occasional power here, as Maxwell is arguing. Oh, the judges and the princes, they just occasionally, when the king calls them to do their job, he does it. Rutherford says that's ridiculous. Like they do their job all the time. They're daily doing their job of making judgments. They don't just act as a judge when the king calls upon them. In this chapter, Rutherford particularly draws our attention to those in society who are making judgments, if you haven't already gathered that. It's not just the king who is making judgments. And if the judgments are shared by the estates or the lesser magistrates, as well as with the king, and if they are based on God's law, then this proves that the people have a power not only equal to the king, but because they make a judgment to put the king in place, that they also at times will have a power over the king if he breaks his oath responsibilities. I will just provide one last quote from Rutherford here in this chapter. Rutherford says, when the supreme magistrate will not execute the judgment of the Lord, those who made him supreme magistrate under God, who have under God sovereign liberty to dispose of crowns and kingdoms, are to execute the judgment of the Lord when wicked men make the law of God of no effect, end quote. The idea here takes us back to Vindicii, if you remember. If you remember, the writers of Vindicii say that there's a covenant that's made between the king and the people. And the covenant is based on certain terms and conditions. If the king violates the conditions, the people must hold him to account. And they can't be excused by saying, well, the king told us not to do this or that, Romans 13. And Rutherford would argue the power that the lesser magistrates have in making judgments every day in society must be employed toward a tyrannical ruler as well. The last chapter we're going to examine is chapter 31. The title for this chapter is, so the first two chapters dealt with understanding a biblical view of what the king is. The second two chapters I wanted to look at dealt with subjects, with the people. This chapter also deals with the people. The title for this is With Self-Defense by Opposing Violence to Unjust. You know what? I think I misprinted that. So I'm just going to read from the book. Whether self-defense by opposing violence to unjust violence be lawful by the law of God and nature. This chapter is particularly helpful because he lays out practical steps on resistance. He first lays out an argument from nature. We should understand that Rutherford is simply looking at God's creation and studying it. He's studying the works of God to find a clue about resistance. Then he will go to the scriptures to find more clues. First, let's look at what he has to say about nature and resistance. I quote Rutherford, "Self-preservation in all creatures in which is nature is in the creatures suitable to their nature." I know that's kind of a complicated sentence. He goes on, the bull defends itself by its horn, the eagle by her claws and bill. It will not follow that a lamb will defend itself against the wolf any other way than by flying. So men, and Christian men, do naturally defend themselves. But the manner of self-defense in a rational creature is rational, and not always merely natural. Therefore, a political community being a combination of many natures may be permitted by God to use natural self-defense. End quote. Rutherford looks at God's creation, specifically at the animals, and he sees how God created them to defend themselves according to their nature. Predatory animals defend themselves with tooth and claw, whereas prey defend themselves by flight. Human beings are also God's creatures. God has built in our nature self-preservation and defense. But we are not merely animals. We are made in God's image. Therefore, we are rational and reasonable. So the way in which we defend ourselves as human beings cannot merely be instinctive as animals. Our manner in self-defense must be tempered with rational thought. So a thoughtful observation of creation will lead us to believe that God has hardwired all of creation for self-preservation and defense. Next, Rutherford takes us to the scriptures to show us rational steps for self-defense. He first goes to 1 Samuel, to the account of David and Jonathan. You remember the story. Saul was angry at David without cause and wanted to kill him. David had a high regard for the king and would not instinctively seek revenge. What steps did David take? I quote Rutherford here. For a private man may defend himself against unjust violence, but not in any way he pleases. The first way is by supplication and apology. He may not presently use violence to the king's servants before he supplicate, nor may he use reoffending if flight may save. David used all three in order. He made his defense by words, by the mediation of Jonathan. When that prevailed not, he took himself to flight as the next. But because he knew flight was not safe in every way, and nature taught him preservation and reason in light of grace taught him the means, and the religious order of the means for self-preservation, he therefore adds a third, quote, he took Goliath's sword and gathered 600 armed men, and after that made use of a host, end quote. So let's consider two things from this quote. First, the scriptures do teach rational steps that we can take in response to tyranny. Rutherford points out the steps must be in order. The first step is supplication and apology. Today we would say the first step is protest or the soapbox. But I think it's interesting that Rutherford here wants us to interact, even personally and rationally, with irrational magistrates and rulers. Protesting and soapboxes can tend to be mere monologues. As rational creatures, we must endeavor to dialogue with rulers who are unreasonable and oppressive. The second step Rutherford points to is flight or fleeing. But he says flight should not happen unless supplication has failed. He adds further that some people are not able to flee. The sick, the lame, and the elderly would not be able to flee. This is one of the reasons Rutherford says why more people in his country did not flee to the Americas, because they weren't able to. And further, he points out later in the chapter that if everyone flees and leaves behind the sick, the lame, and the elderly, they're going to be devoured, he says, by the lion. So he argues that for some, it would be neglect of their duty to run away and not defend the helpless. But for others, you can imagine maybe small families, poor families, to flee. But people who had considerable wealth and power, he would argue, you need to stay and fight. The last step, which must not be used unless both the first and the second step fail, is armed resistance. Rutherford offers this bit of advice regarding armed resistance. Quote, "By the law of God and nature, we are to use violent reoffending for self-preservation and put to this necessity when armies are in actual pursuit of all the Protestant churches of the three kingdoms, to actual killing rather than be killed, and suffer laws and religion be undone," end quote. Rutherford even goes on to say that if a king was to come into your home suddenly, against law and against reason, to harm or kill you or your family, he says you have every right to defend yourself and even kill the king if they were to do that in your home. He's thinking of all the implications of self-defense here. I really hope you can see that resistance in whatever step, so far from being an animal-like instinctive reaction to trouble, is a thoughtful, reasonable, and patient response to evil rulers. Rutherford would want us to be careful to follow every step in order, and in this way, do what pleases the Lord. In 1661, Samuel Rutherford was on his deathbed. A summons came to him from King Charles II to appear before Parliament for the charge of treason. This was 17 years after he published his Lex Rex. It already made its rounds. Everyone in the Westminster Assembly had a copy of it. And everyone knew about Lex Rex. A summons comes to his door. He's at St. Mary's on his deathbed. He's to stand trial for treason. He would be hanged for treason. Because of the constant shifting political powers between Protestant and Catholic rulers in the UK, the Church of England was now back in power under Charles II. And while on his deathbed, Rutherford responded to those who brought the summons from King Charles. This is Rutherford's response. You'll like this. "I have got a summons already before a superior judge and judicatory, and I am behooved to answer my first summons, and ere your day come, I will be where few kings and great folks come." End quote. Said, "You're too late. I'm going to another king." Rutherford died peaceably at St. Mary's College and was buried on the property, I believe, if I remember reading correctly. The church in which he preached at Anwath is still there today. It's basically just a stone structure. It's everything but the roof, basically. It's an interesting looking building. More importantly, the legacy that Rutherford left in his writings continue on today. As I said before, Lex Rex is the most comprehensive writing on resistance theology, and if you can see, it's not a novel paperback. This book was never refused by the Catholic authorities in its day, but they hanged it. His thinking, along with that of Calvin and the writers of the Vindicii, strongly influenced the founding fathers of this country and helped them to form a new nation with the forms and freedoms that we still enjoy today. I know there is more work to be done regarding a biblical view of government, but were it not for men like Rutherford, Calvin, Knox, Junius Brutus, Luther, we would very likely be under an absolute monarch today, and who knows if we would even be in this country. I hope that was a helpful sampling of Lex Rex. There were some other chapters that I really wanted to get into, like chapter 33, whether or not Romans 13 argues anything against the lawfulness of defensive wars. So he's starting to talk about war. He addresses that. In chapter 38, whether monarchy is the best form of government. That would be another interesting thing to talk about. And I'm probably going to get into them at some point myself. And if you want to, buy the book. It's like $18 on Amazon. I want to close with one last word. I hope I have provided you with enough evidence to prove that the Reformation was not just about doctrine and ecclesiology. It wasn't just about reforming the church. There were some reforms that happened in government, okay? Some would argue today that the Reformation in civil government was too small and not long-lasting. I agree. We've got work to do. The coastlands wait for his law. Amen. Comments or questions? Andrew.
I mean, I just think that the comment, quick, is that you've seen development here over the course of all the stuff that you taught. I mean, from Calvin's time to this, I mean, this is development, this Semper Reformanda, and which is also like, and we continue to work on it, right? Like,
Yeah.
It's not like all the great thick books have been written and there are no more, books to be hashed out. Like, I think, actually, I haven't read it, but Joe Booth's big, thick,
Mission of God, yeah.
Mission of God,
Yeah.
economy is,
Right.
Another thing that probably, hopefully, will have some durability
Yeah.
for decades there, and we need to work on it. But I was just thinking on when you were going through the three steps.
Mm-hmm.
The second one being flight. It struck me that obviously it seems that the colonists, the guys in the Americas prior to 1776 were working through these steps.
Oh, yeah.
But part of the reason why I think that they were willing to take up arms is because they had already, their ancestors or themselves had already taken flight from Europe. Like,
right.
The people in America, they were already kind of backed into the last kind of, it's not the last frontier on earth, but
yeah.
like they had already pulled up stakes.
Yeah.
And had already kind of come
Mm-hmm.
for freedom, religious freedom.
Right.
And here they are.
Well,
again.
it's interesting that so Rutherford is was not tried because he died, but not shortly after the English committed regicide under Cromwell, and and then there's persecution after that because Cromwell is made Lord Protector, but then like the people they still want a monarch, so like they weren't able to. It looked like Rutherford was trying to push like a republic, like a constitutional republic, I think. But at any rate, the people who once it reverts back to a monarchy, more people flee, and come to America. The ones who committed regicide, and there's like streets in New England named after those people. So, but the progress in the development of resistance theology from Luther to Rutherford, you can see it. And I think what I noticed is as the persecution increased, the theology got better and more people started thinking more. It pushed them into the Word to say, it's one thing to say, the king is telling me to disobey. It's another thing to say, the king is murdering everyone. They're different. They're both important questions, but they're both driving you to look for different answers regarding resistance. And I think that is, and it's the same today. I think it's the same for people with the tyranny of COVID. It drove people thousands of people to say, what does the Bible say about government? That's why a number of us are here. So, but that's, yes. I'm sorry. Did you want to say something else, Andrew? Okay.
Well, I have another quick question.
All right, I'll come back to you. Yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
Do you know what role or influence Lex Rex played with the Westminster Divines, especially with just the difference between like the British version of the Confession and then the English version or American version? Because you said it was like everyone obviously would have been familiar with it. I guess what I'm referring to is like one of the key differences when it comes to civil government is the British version says that it's the magistrate has the right to call councils and
Right.
which kind
Yeah.
of fits into this whole modern sacralism debate.
Yeah.
Which the American version, they changed that, they got rid of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
That's
that,
why I'm curious about to see what
Yeah.
influence Lex Rex would have played
yeah,
on that.
yeah.
Play.
If you look at like the title page for the Westminster Standards, it's like by the direction of Parliament. They're still, they don't have a problem with being under Parliament's oversight and stuff like that. Yeah, how much influence did, I mean, I read, I think it was either Beakey or maybe it was in here where they said that like pretty much everyone in the Westminster that partook in the Westminster Confession had a copy of this. They also had a copy of Maxwell's Sacrosanctum Regnum Jus Majestas or whatever. So, and I think that's where I think we would say there's a lot of good stuff in the Westminster Standards, but I think the American version is better. It deals with that separation. That those, I mean, they didn't get everything right. Okay, so I think we need to learn from that and say like, there's a lot of good stuff that came out of the Westminster Standards, and the 1689, which is basically the same thing except for a couple areas. So we like it too. Was that helpful? Okay. Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, so you had alluded to like a couple chapters there on war and on monarchy. So have you kind of looked and what, in a word, like what's his thoughts? Is monarchy his? You kind of were saying that he was pushing for maybe a republic constitution. So is the
I said Cromwell was.
Oh, well,
Yeah,
okay. So
yeah.
Rutherford, what was in a few words, what's his thoughts on monarchy as the ideal form of government?
I'm going to have to read it. I think I remember hearing that or reading something that like he, I mean, just the fact that he's bringing it up, I think he's saying like it's not. I think I remember him saying like it doesn't have to be the only form of government. But again, I haven't read it. I haven't read that chapter yet. So yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. Thank you.